All right, so, um, when you think about the early American frontier, like that vast, untamed, like expanse, right? What comes to mind? I mean, for me, it's like, I don't know, pioneers, new beginnings, all that.
Yeah, it's that classic image, right?
Yeah.
But, underneath all that promise, there were some serious dangers lurking out there.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I'm not even just talking about the wilderness itself, the wildlife, the elements, all that. I mean, there was something way more like chilling that emerged from that whole scene.
What's really interesting to think about is, like, how in this kind of almost lawless environment, right? You,
Yeah.
you had these individuals who popped up who were just like next level brutal,
Yeah.
even for those times.
Exactly. And that's exactly what we're diving into today, the story of these two guys, Makaja Big Harp and Wiley Little Harp. These brothers, operating in the late 1700s, I mean, they basically roamed across a huge chunk of territory, Tennessee, Kentucky, Illinois, even down into Mississippi. And you know what? They're often considered the very first documented serial killers in the U.S.
And, if you kind of zoom out a bit, it makes sense in a way. Like, think about it. You're trying to build a country,
Yeah.
expanding westward, but it's just chaos, right? There's hardly any law enforcement, especially in those isolated settlements. So for anyone with bad intentions, I mean, it was basically a free-for-all.
Oh, totally. And here's the thing. For us, trying to piece together their story, records from back then are pretty scarce. So what we know about these guys is like this crazy mix of documented events and like straight up chilling folklore.
Yeah, it's almost like trying to separate fact from fiction, right?
Exactly. And get this. Estimates of how many people they killed, they range from 39 to maybe even 50 or more. So in this deep dive, what we're going to try to do is look at all the historical accounts, try to make sense of these brutal dudes and the impact they had on the early American frontier. Kind of a dark side of history thing.
It's definitely a dark chapter, that's for sure.
So where do we even start with these guys? Like, where did they come from?
Well, the most common story puts their roots in Orange County, North Carolina. Born to Scottish parents, most likely. Makaja, whose real name was probably Joshua, was born sometime before 1768. And Wiley, maybe originally William, came along before 1770.
Okay, so that's the standard version. But there's another theory, and it's kind of interesting, that they might have been first cousins. And get this, they both would have had the same first names too, Joshua and William Harper, and they supposedly emigrated from Scotland a bit earlier, around 1759 or 1760, with their dads.
See, that's what I love about history, right? There's always another layer, and that makes you think, like, does the brother's story get passed down because it's simpler?
Oh, for sure. It's definitely a more dramatic narrative.
Exactly, but if they were cousins, it kind of adds a whole other dimension to their relationship,
Yeah.
Maybe it even played a part in how they acted later on, who knows? But either way, what we do know is that their families were pretty devout Calvinists and super loyal to the British Crown, like hardcore Tories.
And you know what that means, right? It puts them right in the middle of all the tension brewing at the time, first with the War of the Regulation, then the American Revolution.
Oh, yeah. They were on the wrong side of history, for sure. And to really understand how high the stakes were, their dad, or dads, if you go with the cousin theory, they were basically blacklisted because of their Tory beliefs. Couldn't even join the Patriot forces.
Talk about being caught in the crossfire.
And then things get even worse. There are accounts of a Patriot attack on their home and, like, their parents being lynched. I mean, can you imagine?
Wow, that's heavy. I mean, to witness something like that as a kid, that's got to leave a mark.
Oh, absolutely. It's the kind of trauma that can really shape a person, especially at that age. And so the story goes, after this whole tragedy, they basically run off into the wilderness, end up being taken in by the Chickamauga Cherokee.
Okay, so the Chickamauga, for those who don't know, they were like this faction of the Cherokee who were totally against American expansion, right?
Right, they were led by this guy, Dragon Canoe, and they were constantly clashing with settlers. So for the Harpe brothers, this wasn't just about finding a safe place. They were stepping into a world that was already super violent.
Yeah, like survival mode 24/7. And supposedly they picked up a lot of skills from the Cherokee, hunting, trapping, even raiding. But what's really disturbing is that they also apparently learned some pretty brutal methods of torture and killing.
It's like this dark twist on cultural exchange, They're learning how to survive, but also how to inflict pain. And it really sets the stage for what's to come.
So before they go full on, into the horrific stuff they're known for, there's this period where it seems like they almost try to blend in, live a normal life, at least for a little bit. Around 1775, both of them were working as overseers on a slave plantation in Virginia.
Yeah, it's a bit of a jarring detail, right? But it shows you how complex their story is. Like, These guys who would later become infamous for their brutality were at one point part of the system.
Right, it's not so black and white. And then there's the whole thing with the women in their lives. Makaja had relationships with Susan Wood and Maria Davidson, who also went by Betsy Roberts. And he had kids with both of them. Wiley married Sarah, Sally Rice, in 1797. And, Sally's story, well, it takes some pretty wild turns later on. We'll get to that.
Yeah, the women and kids definitely add another layer to this whole thing. It makes you realize that these guys weren't just monsters. They had connections, relationships. But again, it doesn't excuse anything they did later on. Not even close.
Right, exactly. So we've got this backdrop, right? A messed up childhood, political upheaval, violence all around. And now we got to talk about their involvement in the wars of the time. Because let's be real, their Tory loyalties, that was a major driving force for them.
Oh, yeah, it was like a fire in their bellies. And there's this account from Captain James Wood. He was a Continental Army officer. And he claimed the Harpes were part of this Tory rape gang during the Revolution. I mean, the name alone tells you everything you need to know.
Yeah, that's intense. So it wasn't just about fighting, it was about terrorizing anyone who supported the Patriots. And get this, they were even accused of kidnapping young girls.
That adds a whole other level of messed up to the story, right?
It's dark, man. And it wasn't like they were just freelancing either. They actually fought as part of the Loyalist militia under Major Patrick Ferguson at the Battle of Kings Mountain in 1780.
And here's a crazy little detail for you. Frank Wood, Susan Wood's brother, he said he saw them there. Even took a shot at Makaja, but missed. Talk about a close call.
Can you imagine? What if he'd hit him? History might have gone down totally different. They also fought under the super notorious guy, Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton, at battles like Black Stocks and Cowpens. So they were in the thick of it, no doubt.
They were committed, that's for sure. And when the British lost at Yorktown, instead of giving up, they retreated back to Tennessee with their Chickamauga buddies.
Yeah.
They just weren't done fighting.
So even after the war is basically over, they're still involved in attacks, like the one on Bluff Station, which is where Nashville is now. And get this, they were at the Battle of Blue Licks in 1782, where they actually helped defeat a force led by Daniel Boone.
Daniel Boone, that's crazy,
I
right?
know, right? That's a legendary frontier figure.
Yeah.
So these guys, they were the real deal. They lived with the Chickamauga in the village of Nickajack for over a decade.
Yeah, and you got to think, all that time spent in that environment, it probably reinforced those brutal tendencies they'd picked up. I mean, it's a pretty stark example of how violence can become a way of life in those kind of conditions.
Absolutely. So eventually Nickajack gets destroyed, and they move on to Powell's Valley near Knoxville, Tennessee. And there's this theory that they might have even changed their last name from Harper to try and hide their Tory past.
Smart move, really. Especially in a region that was becoming more and more pro-patriot. They had to adapt to survive. And we know for sure they were in that area because there's a record of Wiley's marriage in Knox County from June 1797.
And then comes 1799, a big turning point. They get captured and thrown in jail in Danville, Kentucky, but of course they don't stay there for long.
Oh yeah, classic Harpe Brothers, right? Always on the run. But even during that short time, they're linked to another killing. This time, a young black man near Mammoth Cave.
Yeah, it's like their capacity for violence just kept escalating. It wasn't just about politics or war anymore. It was like they had a taste for it.
It's a pretty disturbing pattern.
All right, so we've covered their early life, their wartime exploits, but now we got to get into the really heavy stuff, their descent into becoming full-blown serial killers. This is where things get really dark, and we're talking 1797 onwards.
Yeah, this is where they go from being violent criminals to something way more sinister and terrifying. Their own confessions put them at 39 murders, but most folks think the real number's higher. Maybe even over 50.
And it wasn't just the number, it was how they did it. I mean, they were brutal. They'd kill anyone for, the smallest thing. They showed no mercy. Didn't matter if you were a man, a woman, or even a baby.
The one that got them run out of Knoxville is a good example. They stole some pigs and horses, which was bad enough, but then they murdered this guy named Johnson and dumped his body in a river, weighed down with stones. And that right there becomes their calling card.
Yeah, that whole weighted body thing, it gives me chills. And things were so bad that in April 1799, the governor of Kentucky, James Garrard, put a $300 bounty on their heads. That was a ton of money back then, so they were causing serious panic.
Oh yeah, they were public enemy number one, for sure. And as they were running from the law, they killed even more people. There was this peddler named Peyton, a couple of travelers from Maryland, a guy named John Langford. And then after the escape from that jail in Danville, They got revenge on someone who'd helped the authorities by murdering his son and, like, mutilating the body.
Talk about holding a grudge.
It's just pure malice, right?
Yeah, it's messed up. And get this. They tried to lay low with this group of river pirates at Cave and Rock on the Ohio River. This was like their hideout, led by a guy named Samuel Mason. But even those guys who were hardcore criminals, even they thought the Harps were too violent. They were supposedly pushing people off cliffs for fun.
That's saying something, right?
Right, like if you're too much for a band of river pirates, you know you're in a whole other category of crazy. So they kept moving north, leaving bodies in their wake. There was Edmonton, Stump, 3 more guys near the Saline River in Illinois. Just a trail of death.
It's a bleak picture of what the frontier could be like. And then, for some reason, they decide to head back east to Tennessee. More killings. Bradbury hard coffee. Then there's William Ballard, found disemboweled. James Brassel with his throat slit. John Tully. It's just horrific.
It's hard to even imagine the terror those communities must have felt. And in Kentucky, they murdered this guy John Graves and his teenage son with an axe. Then in Logan County, they killed a young girl, an enslaved person, a whole family. They just didn't discriminate.
And here's one that's just particularly disturbing. Makaja. He killed his own baby daughter near Russellville, Kentucky, just because she was crying.
Seriously?
Yeah. And apparently it was the only murder he ever showed any remorse for. Imagine that.
That's just, I don't even know what to say to that. It's so messed up.
Right. It's like a glimpse of humanity in this sea of darkness.
Mm-hmm.
But then you have the killing of Trowbridge, found disemboweled again. And what happened at the Stiegel house, that's just pure horror. They killed Major William Love, a guest. Then they slit the throat of Mrs. Stiegel's 4-month-old baby because it was crying. And then they killed Mrs. Stiegel herself. I mean, how do you even process that?
It's beyond comprehension. So we got to remember, right, that a lot of what we know comes from accounts written back then and like stories passed down through generations. It's not always easy to separate fact from fiction, but the sheer amount of violence and how consistent the stories are, that paints a pretty clear picture, I think.
Yeah, there's a pattern there that's hard to ignore.
So before we talk about how it all ended for these guys, let's take a minute to picture them. We actually have some pretty detailed descriptions from that bounty proclamation Governor Garrard put out.
Yeah, it's like a little snapshot in time.
Makaja, he was about 6 feet tall, strong build, early 30s. He had this ill-looking, downcast countenance, whatever that means. Short, black hair, straight build, full face. And he was wearing this striped mankeen coat and some drab cloth leggings and trousers.
So, not exactly blending in.
Right. And then Wiley, he had a thin face, short black hair, but not as curly as Makaja. And he looked older than he actually was, also with a downcast countenance. He had on a similar coat, but with a surtout over it, dark woolen stockings and drab cloth leggings.
It's funny how both descriptions mention the downcast countenance thing.
Yeah, I noticed that too. Like, what does that even mean? Were they just mopey all the time?
Who knows? But it's a little detail that makes you think.
Right. For sure. So their reign of terror, thankfully, it couldn't last forever. They were being chased by a posse led by this guy, John Leiper, and Moses Stegel was part of it. Remember him? The guy whose wife and baby they murdered?
Oh, yeah, he was out for blood.
Absolutely. So it was this mix of fear and revenge driving that posse, and they finally caught up to the Harpe Brothers near the Stegel cabin on August 24, 1799.
The end of the line.
Yeah. The posse told them to surrender, but they tried to make a run for it. Makaja got shot by Leiper and tackled to the ground, but before he could die from the gunshot, Moses Stegel, he just straight up decapitated him.
Talk about frontier justice.
I know, right? Brutal. And get this. They put Makaja's head on a pole, or maybe it was a tree, at a crossroads. It became known as Harpe's Head or Harpe's Head Road.
Wow, that's a message right there.
Oh, yeah. Don't mess around in these parts. But Wiley, he was a slippery one. He managed to get away, and what else? He hooked back up with the Mason gang. Seems like he couldn't stay away from those outlaw types.
Birds of a feather, I guess. And there's a chance he was actually captured with them a few years later, but nobody recognized him. He was using a fake name, something like John Sutton or John Sutton.
So he was good at hiding, at least for a while. He and Samuel Mason, the leader of the gang, they escaped again, but Mason got wounded.
And then their greed got the better of them. Wiley and another guy from the gang, Peter Alston, they tried to claim the bounty on Mason's head. Talk about bad timing.
It backfired big time. Someone in Kentucky recognized them, not just as being with Mason, but as the Harpe Brothers. They got arrested, escaped again, but were caught again pretty quick. This time they weren't so lucky. They went to trial and were sentenced to hang.
In January 1804, Both Wiley Harpe and Peter Alston were executed.
And just like with Makaja, they didn't just hang them. They cut off their heads and put them on stakes along the Natchez Trace. Another warning to anyone traveling through.
It's grim, but kind of fits the whole story, right?
Yeah, it's definitely a rough ending. But what about the women? Their stories are pretty interesting too, especially compared to the Harpe brothers.
It's like a whole other side to this saga.
After Makaja was killed, the authorities rounded up the women in Russellville, Kentucky. But they let them go.
Sally Rice Harpe, Wiley's wife, she went back to her family in Knoxville, remarried, and eventually moved to Illinois. Susan Wood also got remarried and died in Tennessee. Her daughter ended up moving to Texas. And then there's Maria Davidson, or Betsy Roberts. She got married in 1803, lived on Colonel Butler's plantation for a while, moved to Illinois in 1828, had a bunch of kids, and lived into the 1860s.
It's amazing, right? Like after all that chaos and violence, they managed to build somewhat normal lives.
It's a testament to human resilience, I think.
So the Harpe brothers, their story, it didn't just disappear. It's become part of American folklore. They even pop up in popular culture every now and then.
Yeah, you got to wonder why, right? Like, they were horrible people, but there's something about their story that just sticks with you.
For sure. William Faulkner, he wrote about them in his novel Requiem for a Nun. And they were even part of that jury of the damned in the movie The Devil and Daniel Webster. That's a classic.
And remember that Disney movie, Davy Crockett and the River Pirates? They were in that too, although they toned it down a bit, obviously.
Yeah, right, got to keep it family friendly.
Exactly. But, they've been the inspiration for characters in plays, books, even songs. There's this musical called The Robber Bridegroom from the 70s, and more recently they inspired some characters in this fantasy series called Sharing Knife by Lois McMaster Bujold.
And there have been some more recent takes on their story, too. Like there's an episode of this TV show called Evil Kin, all about them. And this novel, Slab, by Sella Saderstrom, it takes place on land that used to belong to Wiley Harpe. There are even novels that focus specifically on the women, which is pretty interesting.
But, their story keeps evolving,
Yeah, it definitely has staying power. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's safe to say the Harpe brothers, they left a pretty dark stain on the history of the American frontier. Their rough upbringing, the violence they were part of during the wars, and then the whole serial killer thing, it all adds up to a pretty disturbing picture.
Yeah, they're a prime example of how dangerous things could get out there on the frontier, especially when there was basically no law to stop them.
And their story, it's this mix of documented facts and legendary stories. It's hard to know for sure where the truth ends and the myths begin.
Which is part of what makes them so fascinating, I think.
Oh yeah, for sure. But here's a question for you to think about. Why are we still so drawn to these dark figures? What does it say about us, that we're so interested in these brutal parts of our history?
Yeah, it's a good question. And maybe it's not just about the violence, Maybe it's also about trying to understand how people can become so twisted. Like, what makes someone cross that line?
Yeah, that's something to ponder, for sure. All right, folks, that's it for this deep dive into the dark world of the Harpe brothers. Thanks for listening, and until next time, stay curious, but maybe leave the axe at home.
Yeah, probably a good idea.